the question of randomness and chance is a very big philosophical issue or question that people have wrestled with and thought about hard for 100 years or more. It's really one of the core issues, especially in philosophy of science, I think, since probabilities become so important within science. So I think my understanding of randomness and chance are that they really are based, first of all, on probability. Without some sort of notion of the probability of an event, you can't even begin to talk about randomness, let's say. And then the other thing that's very important is that the probabilities have to be law-governed. That is, they can't just be one-off, this has a certain probability, that has a certain probability. It has to be that certain kinds of events have probabilities under certain circumstances. And those regularities are what scientists call laws of nature. The next piece in the puzzle that you need really is the notion of independence. So the idea that two probabilities are independent of each other. So if I flip one coin with one hand and flip another coin with another hand, they each have a chance of coming up 50% chance of coming up heads and tails. And they're independent of each other, right? If one comes up heads, that doesn't make the other one come up tails or heads or something like that. So once you've got that in picture, then you can start talking about randomness. And so an event is random when its probabilities or its chances are independent of things like meaning, purpose, value, and so on. So to take a kind of classic example, the difference between a string of letters that spells out one of Shakespeare's sonnets or something like that, right, on the one hand, and then a random sequence of letters in the other case. And the difference between the two is that the probability of a letter at any given point in Shakespeare's sonnet is not random, right, because it's going to depend upon the meaning or purpose of the sonnet as a whole. Whereas in the other case, a very simple case would be each letter has a 1 out of 26 chance of appearing at each point, no matter what's happened before or what happened afterward. So one of the kind of ironic things is that from a philosophical point of view, you might say that the random sequence is actually the more orderly sequence, because it's very predictable on the basis of relatively simple laws, whereas when you're looking at a sonnet, it's actually quite unpredictable and disorderly in a way, right? I mean, what happens, of course, is the poet is creating a new kind of order in the poem. And if you really understand poetry, maybe you can anticipate what's going on. But it's easy. The poet is also, in a sense, disrupting the order of nature in the process of producing the poem. Yeah, so divine providence is really asking about, or it's a question about the relationship between God and creation and the world that he's made. God can certainly create a world of living creatures, including human beings, through evolution if he chooses, right? Because, again, evolution is going to be describing what's going on at the level of secondary causality. Right? And, as long as a process is, logically consistent and coherent, it's a process that God could, in principle, use, could will into being. And even he could will that this process, even if the process itself is chancy and involves randomness, he could will that the process exist and produce a very specific result, right? Even if the process itself doesn't have that result in mind, it doesn't, in a sense, have the internal resources to guarantee that it'll get there, God can do that. God can both create a process that in and of itself could produce but doesn't necessarily have to produce a particular result. He could will such a process into being and will that it produce a particular result. So I think you can, in a sense, have your cake and eat it too here. You can have both the chancy process and the particular result. I mean, an analogy that I like to use is from the book of Genesis when Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers and in Egypt, and then he becomes the Potiphar, the prime minister, I guess, of Egypt at some point, and is able to save his family from famine. And he meets his brothers at the end of Genesis, and he says, when you sold me into slavery, you intended that for evil, out of jealousy for me, but God intended it for something good. So the very same event, right, which was the brothers selling him into slavery, had, in a sense, there were two levels going on there. There was a level of intentionality of the brothers, which was evil. There's a level of intentionality of God, who was willing that this should happen for some good purpose. And in an analogous sort of way, I mean, evolution could happen where the process doesn't have anything in mind, doesn't have any sort of intention in mind, but God could. And so the very same event at the level of secondary causality could happen in a way that is unintentional, doesn't have us in mind. But at the level of primary causality, it could. God does have us in mind and is using this process to produce us. I mean, there's nothing inside evolution that necessarily points it towards human beings or any other particular outcome. But it's possible for God from the outside, so to speak, to be directing this process to that particular result. Now, admittedly, this is the toughest problem in this area, right? Which is, it looks like you have a kind of over-determination or too much causation going on. From a theological point of view, we say God explains why there are human beings on Earth, and the evolutionary biologist says, well, from a biological perspective, here's this chancy process that would produce human-like beings at a certain point, perhaps, or at least has some chance of doing that, and that's what happened. And so you've got these two explanations, and you might think that they're competing explanations, right? And that you can't have both, or it would be really weird if they had both. It would be like, I pick a number between 1 and 100, and you pick a number between 1 and 100. We both just pick 78, right? For no particular reason. You might think, well, wait, that can't keep happening over and over again. There's got to be some sort of explanation of the coincidence between the two. And that's right. So these two levels of causation, primary and secondary, it's not as though they're on an equal plane, right? And that somehow, by a miracle, they happen to converge on the same outcome. Because that would be a weird coincidence, right? That wouldn't make any sense. So you have to think that the primary causality is, ultimately the true explanation, right, of human beings, of why we're here ultimately. But that doesn't mean that you can't ask, but how did God choose to bring about that end result, right? How did he choose to do it? Did he choose to do it immediately by special creation? He could have. That's certainly an option. Or he could also choose to do it through a much longer process where the process in its own internal structure doesn't have any intention in mind. It's just it's just a series of chance events, right, which are such that given the laws of nature, we can predict will produce living organisms of certain kinds, at least. So, I guess here's a way to kind of put it in a nutshell. God can say something like, let there be evolution, and let it, in a chancy sort of way, produce this specific result, right? So he's both insisting that the process be inherently chancy or random, and that it nonetheless produce a particular result in this particular case. There's at least I don't see any logical inconsistency in that. Now you might ask, well, why would God want to do it that way? Well, it turns out that a world in which there is chance and randomness is actually a very orderly world, as I mentioned earlier. There's actually a close association between randomness and order. So producing a world in which something like an evolutionary process is involved in shaping life on Earth is just a way of maintaining the orderliness, the beauty, and the elegance of the natural world. So I think it does make sense from a philosophical point of view, or even a theological point of view, why he might do things that way.